This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment.
I asked you to send in your weirdest shower thoughts as part of my ongoing quest to show that philosophy really is all around. So let's get started. Here we have a shower thought by Ava Sarnecki, and it reads, "At what point does bread become toast? Like, I know you put it in the toaster, but what if it only gets warm? How much of the bread needs to crustify before being qualified as toast?" This, believe it or not, touches upon one of the oldest quote-unquote paradoxes in philosophy, which is known as the Sorites paradox. The Sorites paradox comes from ancient Greece, and it originally uses the example of a heap. So the kind of question you can pose with the Sorites paradox is, at what point does a kind of loose collection of grains of sand become a heap of sand? To put it in its more straightforwardly paradoxical form, what someone tends to say is something like this. You get someone to agree to the idea that one grain of sand is not a heap of sand. And then you get them to agree to the idea that simply adding one grain of sand can't transform a non-heap of sand into a heap of sand. And then from that, it follows that no amount of grains of sand will ever make this a heap of sand, which just seems absolutely ridiculous. It conflicts with our common sense judgment that heaps of sand exist out in the world. And, in the modern day, this is kind of put forward in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way. It's more of a kind of brain teaser than a kind of a worrying paradox. However, this does touch upon one of my sort of pet passions in philosophy, which is that philosophers, speaking very generally, of course there are exceptions to this rule, don't talk that much about the concept of gradability and gradable adjectives. So, one of the standard solutions to the Sorites paradox, which I am very much in agreement with, and I think that most people kind of are, is that there isn't a moment where a collection of grains of sand becomes a heap. It's just that you gradually get more heap-like over time until you unquestionably have a heap of sand as opposed to grains of sand. So the reason this makes it no longer a paradox, and, I think this is broadly quite a common sense solution to it, is that when you say one grain of sand cannot transform a non-heap to a heap, this reinterprets that as saying, well, yes, of course, a grain of sand can't transform a total non-heap into a heap, but it nudges it a little bit in the heap direction. It makes it more of a heap. And in this case, when this commenter is asking, at what point does it become toast? Well, yeah, it slowly becomes toast over time. Within this, I think there's a real insight more generally, which is that, of course, heaps and toastiness are not the only adjectives for which this is the case. So many of our adjectives function like this, beauty and pleasure and pain and, almost any adjective that you assign to something is going to be gradable. There are exceptions, and to be fair, the exceptions are the kind of things that philosophers are often interested in, things like truth or, perfection. Like, you can't have something being more perfect than another, and all truth, provided you're giving a kind of relatively standard definition of truth in philosophical logic, you would end up with things simply being true or false and not kind of gradable values of true or false. However, what I would say is that almost all of our categorizations are more like gradable adjectives than they are kind of binary sets. So that's a good example of that. So something like athlete. Someone can be more or less of an athlete. You might say that Usain Bolt, he's about as much of an athlete as you can possibly get. Someone like myself who goes to the gym as a bit of a hobby and tries to get 10,000 steps in a day, clearly less of an athlete than Usain Bolt, but in some sense, more athletic than someone who doesn't do any of those things. So many of our adjectives and our categories work a little bit like this. This is partly because one of the ways that we create definitions for things is that we construct prototypes and then we see if things correspond or are similar to those prototypes in some way. That's a very natural way for us to conceive of and construct definitions. The thing is, on the whole, philosophers, again, speaking very generally, don't pay much attention to this, despite the fact that if you were to ask a lot of linguists and a lot of kind of cognitive linguists, they would say that this is a completely ubiquitous part of our everyday speech. a linguist called Galit Sassoon, who I think is actually a formal semanticist, argues pretty convincingly, referencing a lot of different empirical literature, that actually, if you just look at people's everyday speech, they will turn almost every adjective and almost every noun into some kind of gradable category. They will talk about things being more or less of a thing rather than things simply being on and off. The reason why this potentially poses a problem for a lot of kind of formally or logically minded philosophers is that we really like analyzing things with logic, and classical logic is binary. It only has true or false. Or if we want to put it in set theoretic terms, things can only be members of a set or not members of a set. One of the potential ways to expand this so that we can treat a greater number of topics is to use something called fuzzy logic. Fuzzy logic, oh god, the name escapes me of the guy that originally created fuzzy set theory. But effectively, this allows you to have graded membership values and treat those in a pretty mathematically rigorous way. And I think this is a hugely underutilized aspect of philosophy. A lot of my master's thesis was on gradability. I don't think I did it that well, but my main point I wanted to get at is that we, as analytic philosophers, tend to really miss just how ubiquitous and how valuable gradability is. So if you're asking the question, when does bread become toast? And you come to the conclusion that toast is a gradable property, I would say that you are exploring an area of philosophy that not only is incredibly significant and touches upon so much of our everyday speech and everyday categories, but is very much neglected by quote-unquote mainstream philosophical discourse. It's not that there's like a conspiracy against it, it's just not popular. Loads of things in philosophy aren't popular, and this is one of them. It's just one of them things that I happen to be very passionate about. So I very much appreciate this comment. It allowed me to rant about something close to my heart, but pretty niche. Moving on. But before moving on, I want to take a brief moment to thank today's very kind sponsor, Squarespace. If you're looking to build a website, then you know it can be a real pain. First, you have to choose a domain name and then design the whole thing, and there's always this underlying fear that you're messing things up and creating something that doesn't just look untidy, but outright unprofessional. But this is where Squarespace comes into play. They take all of that complexity and compress it down into a single platform, using ready-made templates to take all of the stress and headache out of website building. They also have a feature called Blueprint AI, which uses AI tools to help you make design choices, which is very handy if, like me, you're not necessarily that technologically gifted and don't have the mind of a graphic designer. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain name. But anyway, back to the video. So our next one comes from Android JZ2YH, and it reads, as I haven't seen an argument for why nihilism is false, and I consciously think that it is true, why do I continue putting effort regardless? This is a huge theme in a lot of 19th century proto-existentialist philosophy. It's a really big part of Nietzsche's work, actually, is how, for him, nihilism is only partly a sort of philosophical or semi-logical conclusion that someone comes to after reflection, or like the idea that there are no objective values is something that someone would only come to kind of at the end of a line of argument. But for Nietzsche, that isn't really what nihilism is. And I think that broadly coheres with how we tend to use the term in everyday speech. When you call someone a nihilist, you don't tend to be merely referring to some proposition that they hold. You tend to also be talking about their temperament and their character and how they behave. They might struggle to act. They might struggle to get out of bed in the morning. And for Nietzsche, that is just as important a feature of nihilism, if not a far more important feature. He very much touches upon this point. For him, it is not simply a philosophical conclusion that causes us to become nihilists. It's also a kind of degradation of our instincts. So a huge part of Nietzsche's psychology, and I've talked about this on the channel before, is the concept of a drive and an instinct. And for him, these just come from within. They're like, they're just like impulses. They're of the same variety as hunger and thirst. These kind of inherently motivational states that spring up from within us. And for Nietzsche, that is the way that humans, quote unquote, naturally end up valuing things. We have a strong drive towards something, and so we then rationalize that as a value. For him, the reason why he's concerned about nihilism is because he thinks that we have slowly suppressed and, in his terms, degraded these instincts over the course of many, many generations. And he lays this at the feet of kind of Pauline Christianity. Where do you agree with the specifics of his thesis? His general point is that we are not necessarily dependent on some kind of metaphysics to grant us meaning. It's just that we're so used to metaphysics being the vehicle through which meaning is conveyed, kind of motivational meaning is conveyed, that it seems like without that overarching philosophical stroke metaphysical structure, we would fall apart. But he says that is not necessarily true, provided we have strong enough drives and strong enough instincts. And I think, I think this chimes a lot with people's introspective experience, right? A lot of people would be in the position of this commenter where they think, that there's no inherent value in the universe or something, but that doesn't really touch them in any way yet. It's something that exists as pure theory, pure abstract. And I think this can sometimes lead to people dismissing problems of nihilism out of hand, because just coming to that abstract philosophical conclusion doesn't hurt at a visceral level. And I think that a lot of the times where people drift into felt nihilism, it's only partly a kind of philosophical or thought-through conclusion. It's often caused by an emotionally devastating event, something like losing a loved one, or kind of suddenly losing your job of 20 years or something like that. These kind of things that we intuitively think, that could spark an existential crisis. I think that's when people tend to feel nihilism, even if they've come to that as a kind of abstract philosophical conclusion much, much earlier. So one of the things that I try to do on the channel when I'm discussing nihilism is to try and view it not just through the lens of philosophy, but also through a kind of psychological lens, recognizing that there is only a part relation between a philosophical conclusion that life is meaningless and a felt sense that life is meaningless. And those two things can come together, but they don't always do. I mean, one example of a metaphysical framework that is totally non-nihilistic, but an emotional state that's very nihilistic, is someone like Job at the end of the book of Job, or just before the end of the book of Job, or Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes. These are two theists. They have no doubt about God's existence, but they still doubt the point of living. And I think this really does emphasize the importance of treating this affective component of nihilism. I think that's actually something that Nietzsche's philosophy really brings out in quite interesting and specific detail. So yes, this commenter actually gets at an interesting observation about nihilism that arguably stretches right back to the Old Testament. So yes, there is an awful lot to this shower thought. Right, here we have a classic shower thought from Bill DeWitt 1692, and it reads, "There is no reason to think that the colours other people see are the same as the colours I see." I think this is probably one of the most popular general philosophical thoughts of the modern day. I think that most of us have probably had this realization at some point that there's nothing in our experience that verifies that we're all using color words in the same way, right? When I say red, I could be seeing what you mean when you say blue, as long as the token of the word is being elicited by the same object. Our experiences don't filter into the way that we use the word all that much because they're kind of private. I think that there are a couple of more general philosophical principles that I think this example is very good at illustrating. One is the concept of structuralism. So I don't mean structuralism as in the thing that post-structuralism was responding to or anything like that. I mean as a much broader kind of philosophical approach that looks at the structures of things as opposed to necessarily their individuated property. So a really good example is something like structuralism in mathematics holds that, to a greater or lesser extent, the important thing about maths is not the objects that maths studies, it's the relations between those objects, hence, structuralism about mathematics. This effectively demonstrates, or could be one plank of an argument, that structure is what matters when it comes to our experiences of the world. That is, our inner sensations, in terms of how we communicate about reality, matter less than what the word tokens we're saying are elicited by in the world and how they fit together. The thing about this argument is it doesn't just work for color. It's just that color is a particularly stark example of it. It could be that when I say happy, I mean a very different thing to when you say happy and things like that. We can expand this argument out quite considerably to demonstrate that when we use language, we're not as interested in somebody's internal intentions of what they're picking out in their kind of private experiences as you might first expect. A very intuitive account of language, when you first start thinking about it, is something like, well, when I talk about the table, I'm referring to something in my experience. I'm referring to the table that I see. But of course, there are a whole series of properties of my experience that could waver while my language remains the same. So it's one way of kind of combating this initial intuition that many of us have, that meaning is something very, very internal. When I don't say in fact, because I don't think the debate is as settled as that, but at the very least, it strikes me as much more plausible that external properties, and specifically structural properties, are potentially more important. A very extreme version of this view, perhaps, would be something like C.S. Peirce's view. C.S. Peirce is an American pragmatist philosopher, and he wouldn't call himself a structuralist, but I kind of was just using that term relatively loosely. One interesting aspect of his philosophy of language and philosophy of meaning is that he basically thinks that if something is of no practical consequence, that is, it could not cash out as a difference in behavior or a difference in potential behavior, where behavior includes things like the kind of language that you would speak and stuff like that, he thinks that that means there would be no difference in meaning. This comes out very strongly in his definition of belief, where he basically says, when we say that somebody believes something, it doesn't make sense to talk about that belief separate from any kind of behavior or potential behavior that that person is going to do. He's kind of a nascent dispositionalist about belief. And then he kind of, in his writings, he stretches this to be a kind of broad principle of how we clarify the meanings of terms and how we really ought to approach philosophy as a whole. It's something that's had a big impact on me. I think that a relatively decent rule of thumb when we're talking about a very, very abstract thing is, okay, we've gone very, very abstract. How will it then come back down to earth and begin to affect either how people view the world or how they behave in the world? How will this translate back into something that we can see? Because otherwise, without a criteria like that, it's very, very easy to veer off into purely abstract speculation. And, I think that's kind of interesting. It's just not the kind of philosophy that I personally find most interesting. I'm not a kind of deeply abstract metaphysician. But I think that this commenter gets a very interesting point, which is that when we are talking about the world, the only possible way that we could have learnt about that is not by referring to the objects and experiences within people's heads, but instead the public realm that we all have access to. Beyond simply, idly speculating about whether you and I see the same colors, I think it gets to a deeper part about language, which is that definitions and linguistic meaning more generally is not plausibly, for me at least, I don't know, you may disagree, not plausibly a purely internal phenomenon. We are very interested about what people mean, what people intend their words to be taken as, but that's not the same thing as resigning all meaning to just some kind of internal experiential realm that's totally private to them. But either way, I think this is a very good example of how shower thoughts do not need to be some kind of trivial matter. Even these thoughts that many of us have had many, many times can hint at and tie into much deeper and more complicated philosophical issues than might first appear. But anyway, on to the next one. Right, here's a fantastic shower thought from Penelope Olsen 923, and it reads, "You may have addressed it in a video, but I think a lot about how optimistic pessimism is. When things go wrong, the true pessimist isn't disappointed because it's what they expected. When things go right, they're pleasantly surprised. A true pessimist wouldn't have to deal with false hopes. I don't know if it's better to not have hope and also not be disappointed, or if it's better to have hope and disappointment." This touches upon a theme that many philosophers have talked about regarding hope and disappointment and their kind of interrelation. Perhaps the most famous example of a philosopher talking along these lines is someone like the Stoic philosopher Seneca. In his letters to Lucilius, he talks about steeling yourself against disappointment by basically attempting not to hope very much. And yeah, he kind of gives a very similar argument here. He says that, a lot of these hopes are going to be false, and either way, it's better to expect the worst and be pleasantly surprised than to not expect the worst and then the worst to happen and you to be totally blindsided, and not just be blindsided by that event, but also have your vision of what reality is like fundamentally shattered. I don't know if I get that feeling reading Seneca, but I love the pessimistic philosopher Émile Cioran, and I'm working on a video about him at the moment. And it was very difficult because one of the things that I get reading the work of pessimistic philosophers like Cioran is they weirdly make me feel very, very at peace. And bearing in mind, Cioran is a dark philosopher, arguably one of the darkest philosophers ever, just in terms of like the words he is saying and the statements he's making and the propositions he's putting forwards. But at the same time, reading someone like him or Schopenhauer or Philip Mainlander, I'm sort of making my way through the philosophy of redemption at the moment because it got translated into English recently by like an official publisher. Reading pessimists, I can only describe the feeling as they sort of take the pressure off. One of the things that comes across quite well in Choran's philosophy is just, he so blatantly doesn't expect life to go well at all. He sort of thinks that existence is set up for misery. Now, I don't agree with that, totally at least. I do think that obviously, misery is an unavoidable part of life. And sometimes reading a philosopher who just takes that to the extreme and thinks that misery is almost the defining characteristic of life, it's not that it puts my own problems in perspective so much as it makes my own problems unsurprising to me. It makes them no longer seem very tragic. I think one of the reasons why we can get caught up in our own problems, I mean, I'm hardly the first person to point this out, I'm sure that many of you have come to very similar thoughts on this, is that it is thwarting an expectation and as a result also thwarting a kind of narrative of how we thought our life was going to go. One of the things that Choran takes pains to point out is that all of these narratives were kind of false to begin with, in that they probably didn't recognize just how disappointing existence can be. And weirdly, recognizing how disappointing existence can be makes it less painful when things are going wrong. And I think part of it is just that you feel less alone, right? Your situation is not necessarily just as it ought to be, but just as you would expect it to be. That kind of helps dispel some of the guilt, I think, that can happen when life goes wrong. I'm not suggesting that, things don't go wrong because of someone's own fault, but many things go wrong not because of someone's own fault. I think the pessimistic philosophers are very good at bringing a bit of comfort, I suppose, or consolation in that hour of need, I guess. And I like it because it's one of those things that you wouldn't necessarily expect, cracking open a book by a philosopher who famously is completely miserable and depressive about life, and you come away feeling strangely light, as if because kind of a heavy backpack has been taken off of you by a French-Romanian man. I think that the other thing that definitely comes across in Choran's work, that again, I'm kind of writing the script for this at the moment, and I desperately want this to come across, and I don't quite know how to put it, is that there's something about Choran's particular philosophy that helps you take life less seriously in a very visceral way. I think part of it's the fact that among a lot of his very pessimistic aphorisms, there's these kind of, there's so much humor in them. He writes in a very humorous way. You end up putting down one of his books thinking not only, all of the disappointments in my life are just to be expected. And, that kind of not feeling as alone and not feeling like a particular tragedy has happened. But in addition, in some sense, before you read this pessimist, you were laboring under the delusion that life was an eminently serious matter. And Choran is so determined to not take it that seriously in quite a lot of his writings. I don't know, it kind of instills this strangely comic attitude. It's almost like, God, this is like a sort of wanky way to put it. It's almost like kind of, you feel like you're moving slightly beyond tragedy and into a kind of slightly comic or farcical way of viewing the world. And of course it wears off over time, but it's one of those things I've always really appreciated about Choran's writings. And yeah, I would highly recommend pessimistic philosophers kind of for this reason. They weirdly, despite the fact that a lot of their writing is like, oh yeah, life's really miserable, man. We're all gonna just like suffer and die. And then you quite often just put down the book and feel better about life in a very strange way. It's very difficult to describe, and I definitely haven't put it quite as I would want to here. But I think this person's really onto something. I would highly recommend Choran's work. I would especially recommend the first 30 pages of A Short History of Decay, because I think that's Choran at his best. Partly because, there's lots of like pessimistic goodness in there as well, but really the kind of humor and the idea of pessimism engendering a kind of light-hearted approach or semi-light-hearted approach to aspects of life, I think really shines through. Yeah, I know. I can't give it a high recommendation other than that whenever something quite unpleasant happens in my life, I quite often reread those 20 or 30 pages, and I always end up feeling slightly better about things. Makes me less anxious about the future as well. So no, I think there's quite a lot on that comment. I think that's a worthy through line to pursue. And again, an excellent example of a shower thought hinging onto some eminently sophisticated philosophy. But anyway, on to the next one. Okay, this next one was a link to a Reddit post that was emailed to me by a subscriber, so thank you very much for that. It's by Techno Waffle, and it reads, "It would be weird if a human yelled out, 'Anyone wanna screw?' but birds do it all day and nobody cares." So I think this is a very interesting observation, partly because it reminds me a lot of this one chapter of Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation, when he talks about the reproductive drive. So implicit in this shower thought is the idea that the analysis of birds' mating rituals and the way that they squawk and stuff is like a direct request for intercourse and reproduction. And something that Schopenhauer brings up in this analysis of the reproductive drive is that he thinks that a lot of human behavior is that, but in disguise. You know, he's writing in the mid 19th century, so this is a pretty revolutionary and new idea for the time. He talks about how the will to reproduce will, in effect, play kind of little illusory tricks on us. So it won't say, yeah, you need to get making babies with this person right now. It will instead say something like, "Oh, that person's really beautiful, and aren't they very funny, and aren't they very charming, and God, they like me. Isn't that absolutely wonderful?" And that will be how it gets its goal achieved, so to speak. And this observation by Schopenhauer, when I was reading this shower thought post, made me think, well, when we see a bird doing a mating ritual, we see it just as that. But like, in some sense, what does it mean to the bird? For the bird, is it the equivalent of an outright sexual proposition in direct, explicit language? Or is it more like taking someone you fancy for dinner and seeing where it leads? I think that, I don't know, this just struck me as an interesting coherence between this shower thought and this one bit of Schopenhauer. And it also got me thinking, if, say, there was an alien civilization observing us, and it sort of didn't speak our language, but it could kind of view our behavior and watch what happens after we make sounds at one another, it might say something like, "God, these humans, they go to restaurants and they just like fling sexual propositions at one another, and that's insane. Could you imagine if we did that?" And then, of course, the aliens will have their own little mores around reproduction, their own little rituals there. But like, I don't know, it just makes me wonder, from a Schopenhauerian perspective, are we just like the birds here? Are we also just saying, "Want to screw" to a bunch of people every time we go out on dates? But just like the bird, we're dressing this up in our own elaborate dances, our own songs, our own little mating rituals. I'm sure, obviously there are relevant differences in that human behavior is much more complex and stuff like that. But I find it interesting because I wonder whether, just as this shower thought poster has analyzed all kinds of bird mating behavior to the statement, "Do you want to screw?" whether an outside civilization would look at human behavior that we don't think of as saying, "You want to screw." We think of it as saying something far more nuanced and complicated, whether they would just analyze that as "You want to screw," and whether they're right. I don't think they are, but I'm willing to be proven wrong. Schopenhauer talks about how the drive or the will to reproduce is kind of cloaking itself in different disguises. So Schopenhauer, attempting to take the outside view, does argue that all of this is ultimately driven by the will to reproduce. I don't know if that's the same thing as analyzing the behavior as only containing the content of the question, "Do you want to screw?" I suspect that those are slightly different. And I suspect that Schopenhauer would probably think that as well. I just think that he might not quite put it that way. But yes, that's a very interesting thought experiment. And it does make me wonder, when we assign intentional or semantically contentful states to things like pets or other animals, are we totally skimming over the nuance of whatever communicative relations that are occurring between them? I don't know. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's very interesting. One of my friends works in animal cognition, so I might just send him an email and ask him whether anyone is thinking about this. They're probably not. They probably have more important things to think about. I know. That's definitely going to keep me up at night. Right, next up we have a shower thought by Ira S, and it reads, "Nothing is technically stopping me from just deciding to become a completely different person, personality and behavior-wise, right now, and start acting according to that." Obviously, there are responses you can give to this shower thought, right? You could say something like, "No, actually, the universe is deterministic," and you kind of make those counter-arguments. However, I think that a very interesting perspective on this comes from the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, because Jean-Paul Sartre thinks that we're running from this shower thought an awful lot of the time. He One of the most famous phrases in his philosophy is, "We are condemned to be free." And, this can sound like just kind of an edgy statement to throw out there. But what he means by this is that being free is kind of a lot of pressure. If my behavior was totally controlled by some other person, then they would be responsible for everything that I do. When something went wrong in my existence, I could appeal to them and say, well, they made the decision. It wasn't up to me. Sartre thinks that the fact that we don't have this other person to appeal to, this kind of conscious providence to say, no, they made the decision on my behalf, is the cause of quite a lot of humanity's existential angst. So Sartre thinks we put in quite a lot of effort into running away from this shower thought and saying, no, I am not free. There are these other things controlling my decisions. Now, Sartre is not saying that everyone is totally free to achieve anything. He's just suggesting that we have radical responsibility for the choices that we make. But he thinks that we try to run away from even this. And he calls this running away from our choices to act bad faith. Now, we use bad faith in everyday speech to mean something like not engaging honestly with something. But Sartre uses it to mean running away from the fact of our total responsibility for our choices. And he thinks it's perfectly natural to run away from this because of the pressure of freedom. It's a little bit like Kierkegaard's talking about something slightly different, but Kierkegaard compares angst to sort of standing on a ledge and having the realization that you could throw yourself off of it. Like, you have that choice. And Kierkegaard finds this pretty terrifying. And Sartre, touching on similar themes, also finds it pretty terrifying. And so Sartre suggests that we run from this kind of thing. But he ultimately opposes running from this. He thinks that we should try and remain in that shower thought for as long as humanly possible, because he thinks that's ultimately going to be key to living what he calls an authentic life. And by authentic, Sartre doesn't necessarily mean something that reflects an immutable inner soul or anything like that. He means instead a life that is enacted by values that we have chosen and chosen honestly. So I think the shower thought is not only very, very interesting, it corresponds to a key part of Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy. And, I maybe don't quite subscribe to the same kind of radical freedom approach that Sartre has. I am, however, pretty sold on the responsibility part, partly because I think the responsibility is largely a pragmatic matter of navigating the world rather than a sort of heavyweight metaphysical concept. But anyway, I won't go too much into that. My point is that just like many of the other shower thoughts that we've looked at today, this touches upon a realization that philosophers have then stretched out in much more detail. Jean-Paul Sartre is one example of this, but Kierkegaard is equally as in-depth on this idea of like the agony of choice. One of the reasons why I wanted to make this video is that shower thoughts are some of the most intuitive philosophy that we do on an everyday basis. Despite the fact that obviously people post shower thoughts for silly realizations they've come to or just kind of spitballing about something. I think that a lot of the shower thoughts that we have are the same kinds of thoughts that have animated some of the greatest philosophers in history. So part of what I wanted to do with this video is to say, not only can anyone do philosophy, most people are already doing it in some way, shape, or form. And so many of the thoughts that may have fascinated you as water is descending from above and you achieve this glorious moment of peace in your daily routine as the white noise washes over your ears and the water washes through your hair. So many of those thoughts are found and explicated in philosophical treatises throughout history. And if you have had any of the shower thoughts that we've covered today, and you have found yourself philosophically animated by them, then I would highly encourage you to look into some of these philosophers. I'm very bullish on people thinking and crafting and writing their own philosophy and their own philosophical thought. And I think that for many people, they might hear something like that and think, but I couldn't do that. I don't have any philosophical thoughts. My response to that is, what did you last think of when you had a really long shower? Okay, that's all we have time for today. Let me know if you want me to do another of these shower thoughts videos. This was actually really quite fun. If you want to check out some more sort of shower thought-esque, mind-boggling thought experiments, then you can check out my paradox iceberg right here. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.